All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
I understand that the victims of the other crimes start. And Ms. Masida, we have our lunch break at 1 o'clock, and then you can continue afterwards. We've already discussed it amongst the judges. We will again shorten the lunch break to an hour. Not that we think that we need more time, but simply because we want to put it this way. Ms. Masida, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The closing statement for the victims of the other crimes will be delivered as follows. Ms. Fall will start with some introductory remarks. It will be followed by Mr. Dangabo, who will discuss the crimes suffered by the victims. In turn, Ms. Dudzima Lawson and Ms. Rabre-Sandatana will present the prejudice, harms caused to the victims by the crimes, and I will conclude with some remarks on the liability of the accused. Avec votre permission, Monsieur le Président.
With your leave, Your Honour, I shall give the floor to Maître Fall.
Asked to remind you to be at least a little bit careful. Liability of the accused.
I understand that, Your Honour. We have addressed the issue in our closing brief, and I believe victims are entitled to present to this court their position in relation to the liability of the accused.
We will not make a huge fuss out of it because we all know that the closing statements are not evidence, but still a little bit of reluctance and restraint would be appreciated by the chamber. Yeah, and I also think defense counsel will not make a huge problem out of it, but I simply wanted to state it. Yeah?
That's understood, Your Honour.
We all know that the closing arguments are not entailed in the conduct of proceedings specifically. The reason being that they are not evidence, but in the spirit of it, this is why I asked you for a little bit of restraint, and you think you understand me. So then let's start with your presentation.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good morning, Your Honour. Good morning, Your Honours. Within the framework of the division of tasks within our team, my colleagues have asked me to speak to you on the subject of the victims participating in proceedings. As we already had the occasion to point out, and perhaps to repeat, the events that unfolded in the Central African Republic during the period of concern to us have claimed a huge number of victims. But in the end, due to the vicissitudes of the procedures, only 1,965 of them were allowed to participate. Over and above geographical, ethnic, age, and gender criteria, what everyone can see today is that the umbilical cord that unites them is the fact that they are almost all exclusively of Muslim faith. The few Christians in the group were only targeted because of their alliance with a Muslim family. The concept note on the request from states parties for the registry of the court to update its strategy for victims in order to respond to their evolving needs and difficulties they face, states the following, and here I quote, "The International Criminal Court was created to ensure that the most serious crimes of concern to the international community do not go unpunished. And at the heart of this mission is the recognition of the immense suffering endured by the victims. Their testimony, experience, and perspective are invaluable in uncovering the truth and holding the perpetrators to account. And it is for this reason it is essential that the court plans a strategy to ensure that victims are not only heard, but also meaningfully involved at every stage of the proceedings." These statements, coming from one of the court's main, if not the main organ of the court, have, if anything, established the fundamental place that victims occupy in the system. Nevertheless, contrary to the civil law system from which we come, and in where the victims are a party in their own right in the trial, this central position does not make us a party, but rather participants, authorized to intervene only within well-defined limits. This aspect of matters, inevitably linked to the hybrid nature of this institution, was very sincerely one of the first difficulties in explaining and making people understand how the court works to those we represent and among whom illiteracy is widespread. Article 68.3 of the Rome Statute, in Part 2, says, in the official language of the court, or the working language of the court, they are English and French. And that is the reason why, Your Honour, Your Honours, you would allow me at this level to make a speech in English stating the following. It was very far from being a piece of cake, because that better understands, explains my thoughts on this matter. In terms of the practical procedural terms, it was the provisions of Article 68.3 of the Rome Statute which are the cornerstone of our presence, if not our existence, in the trial. And their guarantee can be summed up in the notion of views and concerns. Both terms have a physiological connotation, but above all a mental and physiological one. In other words, the idea of a point of view, at any rate to what occupies the mind. But it has to come, we have to come back to this. In order to be credible, this statement of fact must be based on real life experience. And this is why we're going to focus on factual elements, which we've all experienced here in the courtroom through the multiple testimonials and testimonies that we have been sharing over years, but also and above all that as legal representatives we have experienced in our field, which is the field. For the rest of my life, I will remember the video that we saw yesterday, in which we saw a soldier, supposedly a member of the anti-Balaka, who was mocked in a downright cruel tone, and he was proclaiming loud and clear that this instrument was used to dislodge Muslims from their homes in order to massacre them, not sparing women, children, or the elderly. In all the countries of the world, in all civilizations that we know, the children, in particular babies, women, particularly pregnant women, they are subject to a minimum degree of compassion. But what we have seen, Your Honour, Your Honours, is the summit of cruelty. One can even ask the question if we are still dealing with human beings or humanity, taking into account the tranquility and calmness with which this person was able to say these words. It's really unbearable. On other videos, we also heard soldiers claiming to be anti-Balaka troops. They were saying, "We don't want any more Muslims in our country. The only possibility that we offer them is to leave the country. If they persist, we will massacre them." Beyond today's denials and stringy explanations, Your Honour, Your Honours, these factual elements, which are indisputable, establish irrefutably what lies at the root of everything that happened. In strict compliance with his rights, you authorised one of the accused on the basis of the provisions of Article 67(1)(h) of the statute to make an oral statement. We believe this approach to be entirely legitimate, given the sacred rights of the defence. However, it should not be forgotten that the declaration, which was made without an oath, was made public and translated into the country's local languages and followed by the victims. It would therefore seem to us to be legitimate to share with you the feelings, the views and concerns that the aforementioned statement has given rise to among our constituents. We heard the accused complain about the living conditions and treatment at the prison. He claimed that his diet took no account of his culture. He was only allowed a few visits from his family. I can assure you, Your Honour, Your Honours, that these words have deeply upset the victims, who live in permanent misery. All the more so, as these living conditions, so decried elsewhere, are nevertheless a responsibility of the court, and one can only appreciate the privileged nature of these conditions when, like us, one has experienced the living conditions of thousands of victims crammed into camps who not only can't find enough to eat, they have no relatives to visit them. The two worlds are diametrically opposed as day and night, and for this reason, our team unanimously, within our team, we decided to stop showing the passage devoted to the images of the prison during the screenings that we organised during our awareness-raising missions. It would be catastrophic for the court's image if we were to achieve the opposite of what we set out to promote. We also heard the accused lament not having been able to attend the bereavements of his loved ones. This is indeed a distressing situation, and we share his pain, and we bow piously to the memory of those who have gone. But just imagine what it must have been like for the victims, who, in addition to have lost their loved ones, have not even been able to grieve. The remains having disappeared as if it were by magic. With heavy weapons, we saw, in the hands of these pyromaniacs, it's easy to understand what happened. What's unbearable about navel gazing is its reductive propensity. It seems perfectly natural to think of oneself first, because of the instinct for self-preservation that exists in every individual. But it also seems simplistic to only think of ourselves. Coming from someone who has declared here that he has the ambition of leading his country, to which the victims we represent fully belong to, who live today in clamps, in enclaves, deprived of the minimum necessities of life, are mostly made up of vulnerable people such as women, children, and the elderly, who will not be fooled into believing that they are armed combatants. On the basis of the evidence that we have all seen here, it has become clear that these people have committed no crime other than belonging to the Muslim religion. We have all heard at the same time the main reason why they were the object of attacks. It was simply, as Mr. Jotoje, he must resign, otherwise we're going to commit a massacre. We are going to commit genocide. That is the proof of the innocence of these people. And that is something that we've heard on many occasions, repeated by his men who committed these unacceptable crimes. Faced with the stubborn reality of the facts, we've heard a few attempts at justification, at first denials. But my long experience as a lawyer has taught me that this approach has never been a good defense. Furthermore, it's also worth pointing out that self-defense or resistance, which has been put forward as a justifying fact, is about the concomitance of attack and riposte. But when the riposte comes much later, we have to admit that we are in a situation of revenge and reprisals. Finally, the assertion that I was not at the scene seems inoperative, taking into account the virtual world in which we live. Space and time have been reduced to nothing by technology. The same applies to money transfers. We all know that in our countries they're carried out on street corners, leaving no trace. And we're talking about sums that can be extremely high. We who live in these areas, we can attest to that. And in the final analysis, and with regard to the exercise of authority, it is indisputable that this belongs to the one who has the right to kill his soldiers, simply for not having carried out his orders. By way of conclusion, I'd like to reiterate that in the refugee camps, we have been sailing through an ocean of distress and desolation for the past 5 years. But we have been relentless with our support from the field staff, we encourage victims to keep faith with the court, which we are certain will rule on law in all cases. And the words of Reverend Father Desmond Tutu, hope is being able to see the light despite the darkness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Monsieur le Président,
Your Honour, members of the court, today we are concluding a crucial phase of this trial, which has been going on for years. This court has analysed, scrutinised and heard witnesses as regards the atrocities committed in the Central African Republic during the combats in 2013 and 14. This hearing has highlighted and exposed the scope and the effects of the crimes submitted by the Muslims, which were organized and systematic and has shocked the conscience of mankind. Your Honor, I am a non-practicing Muslim. I am not a Selika. I'm not I am a Muslim, not coming from Central African Republic. This is very important because I come from Kubai. The crimes committed against the Muslims, Your Honor, members of the court, was a methodical use of violence against the Muslim community. The facts were established are very visible. Massacre, extermination. They were motivated by hate, revenge, and carried out large-scale massacres. Entire villages were destroyed. Families were decimated and mutilated, abandoned in the streets or in mass graves. These acts show a will to kill an entire population. 2, ethnic cleaning and forced displacement. The campaign led to the displacement of hundreds of Muslims. The figures are frightening. About 80% of the Muslims were forced to leave Bangui. At a national level, this campaign of terror destroyed entire communities, forcing the population to find exile in Cameroon, Chad, or other neighboring countries. This meeting with the victims has provided us with an occasion to see their situation on a daily basis. 3, the destruction of mosques, a religious symbol. Here we have the Boeing mosque, but in the general context, as we have already said, there was, of the 436 mosques in the Central African Republic, 418 were destroyed or seriously damaged. The systematic destruction targeted not only buildings, but sometimes the faith and cultural identity of the Muslims. They were an additional proof of the desire to exterminate any sign of this communication in the countries, and we have seen this clearly through the various videos shown in this court. 4. Sexual violence and torture. The Muslim women, including adolescents, were subject to collective rapes, which was used as an arm to humiliate and destroy the social tissue of their society. These acts were frequently accompanied with other forms of torture imposed upon the members of their community, including men and children. Children were there as well. Your Honor, perhaps there might be an occasion to extend the notion and idea of rape and torture, because I think this is an opportunity to do so, because when the court reaches its decision and makes its ruling, it could include this approach which has been assimilated, where rape is also regarded as torture, which has been included in the faculty of law and is subject to study. Looting and impoverishment. Your Honor, members of the court. Businesses, houses, and Muslim businesses were systematically looted and burnt. This was not only done physically, but also the victims, which were deprived of their very means of subsistence. Your Honor, I remember a visit where I saw the Egyptian department, and I saw what happened in Egypt at that time. And the gentleman there said that the world has been turned upside down. We're living in the world upside down, where the rich become rich, and your servant becomes your boss becomes the servant. The mother of the household is no longer the mother of the hotel. This is a fundamental text which shows that what is happening in the Central African Republic is a social revolution. An investigation for justice is essential. Your Honors, members of the court. The scope of these crimes and their devastating impact on the Muslim community cannot be overlooked. This trial has enabled us to highlight the responsibilities of the accused, leaders of the anti-Balaka milice in these atrocities. They orchestrated and encouraged these acts of violence with their speeches of hate and calls for revenge. The witnesses, the expert documents have shown quite clearly that these crimes had a strategy which wanted to exterminate the Muslims or kick them out of the country. These actions are war crimes and crimes against humanity according to the statutes of Rome. Long-lasting consequences. The effects of these crimes are still felt today. The Muslim communities, previously major actors in the Central African economy, have been decimated and forced into exile. I'm in a good position to say this because I come from a trading family. Let me tell you, the damage caused was enormous. The social scars are deep. The society has become polarized, and the country is very fragile and remains fragile to this day. This trial is not only looking for criminal responsibility. It is important to look at the victims and tell them that they have not been forgotten. It is also a clear sign to future actors, for these future actors, that such atrocities are never going to be tolerated by the world. A call for justice. Your Honor, members of the court, during this trial, you heard the voice of victims, those who survived, those of families who have lost everything. You have seen the evidence of these inhuman crimes. In your quality as guardians of international justice, we urge you to deliver a judgment that reflects the seriousness of the act's commitment and that will give the survivors reason to hope. This trial can never wipe out the sufferance, but it could establish the truth, condemn those responsible, and reaffirm the fundamental underlying principles relating to these crimes will never be forgotten. Thank you for listening. We urge you to be diligent when considering the items that have been brought forward in my submissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Zima.
Monsieur, ça passe. Monsieur le Président,
Your Honour, Your Honours, my colleagues have asked me to give a presentation of the harm suffered by the victims. The time for truth has come for these victims who participate in these proceedings, the victims being at the heart of these proceedings. For the victims that we represent, the seriousness of the harm resulting from the crimes they suffered, in addition to the evidence presented here within the framework of this trial, justifies establishing the guilt of the two accused present here. This harm justifies the prosecution. This harm is not limited to the consequences, immediate consequences, but also to long-term consequences. We are all in agreement that we're talking about widespread, targeted, and organized attacks. You heard of the anti-Balaka of the north, the anti-Balaka of the south, the anti-Balaka of the centre, etc., with the com zones who were well known. CAR OTP 2061 889, CAR OTP 2061 1552 890. These witnesses of the harm that was perpetrated on the territory of the Central African Republic, and in particular in Bangui, the harm suffered by the victims of gratuitous violence and gratuitous atrocities against the civil population is enormous. We spoke about attacks intentionally directed against the civilian population and not against combatants. They were, in particular, directed indiscriminately against those, often wrongly, considered as Seleka or similar. All that was needed was to be a colleague or a friend of a Muslim, to be the husband or wife of a Muslim, to live in a Muslim neighborhood, and so on, for you to be attacked by the anti-Balaka. During the trial, many witnesses testified that the Muslim civilian population was systematically targeted by the anti-Balaka. The participating victims who were the victims of the above-mentioned attack were, for the vast majority, Muslim and belonged to a wide range of different ethnic groups. This confusion, or this grouping together, has sown confusion and division in the communities, and it has undermined the social cohesion that prevailed there, even though all the witnesses of the parties agreed to the fact that these two communities have always cohabited in perfect harmony. These attacks have led to the displacement and the forced transfer of populations who have found refuge in enclaves, in mosques, churches, schools, and other public places, including part of the Bangui Mpoko airport, with all of the risks with that entails, and living or undergoing catastrophic living conditions. Furthermore, the Muslims were reputed to be cattle breeders and traders. However, in their hasty flight, they were forced to abandon everything and therefore lost everything. As they fled, some victims died of exhaustion. Many victims lost their children on the route because of hunger or malnutrition. All the Muslim victims were forced to leave their usual localities in order to take refuge in countries bordering the CAR, with the result that families have been broken up for over 10 years now. In fact, some members of the same family have been moved to different locations at home and abroad. The situation continues to affect family cohesion. Victims who return home to their country were left desolate because their properties had either been expropriated, despoiled, or even destroyed. This situation plunged them into extreme poverty. Many of the victims' families to this day have not been able to return to their former lives. When victims fall into the hands of the anti-Balaka, they were systematically subject to cruel treatment. They were subject to torture. And in this respect, we have had evidence here that the anti-Balaka acted like people with no soul, no faith, and no law. The victims were attacked by surprise, sometimes while fleeing, brutalized, tortured, wounded. The anti-Balaka inflicted intolerable suffering on them, to the point where they still suffer from the after effects, including physical, mental, and psychological disabilities. Victim A40908 says that he has become weak and is often ill, to the extent to which she can no longer make much effort to work. She also suffers from trauma. We also saw that it is often the case that there is decapitation, mutilation, after a long session of physical torture. And this is how murders were carried out by the anti-Balaka. And if that was not enough, they also attacked religious buildings. According to the testimony of witness P0475, there were approximately 400 large mosques that were destroyed during the conflict in the CAR. And this figure does not refer to small mosques. Witness P5015, a witness for the defense, he stated the following: I know that there have been mosques that have been vandalized. This is the edited transcript of the 12th of December 2023, page 38, line 11. This gratuitous hatred has had a moral impact on the faithful of the mosque concerned. They've been traumatized, given that the Central Africans are very attached to their place of worship. It is part of their life, part of their identity. Many people were not only direct victims of attacks, but also indirect victims of the murder of relatives and loved ones, causing those victims severe mental suffering. In both cases, the indirect victims have not been able to recover the money or the bodies that the bodies of the people that the anti-Balaka killed. And in the Central African Republic in particular, it's difficult to carry out the mourning for a relative when you have not had the remains. And a lot of families suffer enormously from this to this day. Also, in Africa in general, and the Central African Republic in particular, it is large families, the extended family that is the predominant model. That is to say that a household is made up not only of the father and the mother and their children, but it is understood that a couple can have an average of 8 children. But it's also people who are related to the couple as well. And it is clear from what victims have said that the loss of their loved ones has caused significant psychological and emotional suffering for those who depended on the physical and emotional support of the direct victim, because they now no longer have that support. So the murder has had a significant impact on family members who were financially dependent on the deceased direct victims. And this is particularly true of victims who are considered to be the economic pillar of the family or of the household. Relatives who take in orphan children face huge difficulties when it comes to looking after them at the same time as their own children. And a lot of victims complain of loss of memory constantly, of insomnia and other. The participating victims described the rapes, cruel treatment and inhuman acts, imprisonment and serious deprivation of physical liberty and acts of persecution to which they or their loved ones were subjected. Witness P2657 testified that she was pregnant of about 4 months at the time of her rape, and that she is still undergoing medical treatment to this very day due to the pain that there is in her stomach after the rape. Generally speaking, rape has always been a taboo subject in Africa in general, and in the Central African Republic in particular, in Muslim culture. In the Central African culture as well, rape victims are systematically stigmatized by their communities, including by their own families. They are considered unclean, unfit, unworthy, and on the margins of society. As a result of the rape, they have lost their self-esteem. They feel disgusted by sexual relations. They are constantly reminded of the image of rape and poisons and rots their existence. It has been observed that due to the lack of quality medical treatment, many rape victims have difficulty in conceiving. It depends on the way in which these victims were raped. they could be raped by several people. Others continue to experience abdominal pain after being raped. It is a reality to this day. I'm coming to pillaging to finish. The pillaging and the destruction of victims' property is at the root of the drastic change in material conditions of the victims who have become homeless, vulnerable people with no means of subsistence. In this case, the majority of them now live in the greatest extreme poverty. The children of victims' families are dislocated and distraught. All the victims are unanimous when it comes to saying that everything that they had built up their whole lives was stolen in 1 second, in a day. Their suffering is indescribable because the value of everything they have lost is priceless. Many victims have died as a result of the crimes that they have suffered. Many victims were victims of most of the crises that shook the country, and the future of their children has been mortgaged. On the sidelines of these hearings, the participating victims have all stated that it was almost impossible for them to recover due to the consequences of the crimes, some of which have become irreversible due to their gravity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Monsieur le Président,
Your Honour, members of the court. First of all, allow me to greet the victims of Bangui, Mbaiki, of Bosangoa, of the Central African Republic, and elsewhere in Chad, in Jadimina, in particular in Jadima, which is very close. I know that this is going to be transmitted into the camp. It is a camp with 4,000 refugees and also the victims of Cameroon who live in Cameroon, in Congo, and all over the world. Our victims are gathered there, and we are here for them. We are at the closing stage. This hearing is important for the victims. Why? This is what is at stake. This trial is part of a journey of remembrance along the road of resilience. It is a tool of awareness, a path to understanding this war, which remains an enigma for the Muslim illiterate civilian population. Why us? Why me? Small shopkeeper, wholesaler, the semi-wholesaler, the livestock herder, those who do transport. What have I done to suffer these atrocities? Why? How to understand this war? this chain of atrocities? Well, through the testimony of all these individuals, the prosecution, the chamber, the defense, through all the statements and testimonies made, we can look at the facts. They attempt to find the truth by setting out the charges, the dates, the locations, the names that resound, such as the École de la Liberté, a learning place which became a camp for the displaced. Also, the Yamoire school, a place of torture. For example, Monsignor Renaud, the Archbishop, who tried to provide food to these victims who sought refuge in this terrible place. This entire trial provides food for thought and enables them to visit their terrible experience, very heavy, very traumatic, very deeply buried. They have in their memory the scenes which they envisaged, the women who were subject to rape, still face these images that pursue them. The victim of a camp in Gaoui in Chad told us in our last visit in November, said very bitterly, our men have become tramps. They sleep on the ground in tarpaulin tents. Our children don't go to school. They've become ignorant. We live like animals, surviving in complete destitution. Why? Why? And so, from questioning to questioning, from exchanges between them, from listening to the hearings, painful listening, also psychologically painful to follow. The path is pieced together of a memorial construction of this shameful page in the history of the CAR, and a mental image is made of their personal experience. That is what is at stake, and that is why this closing phase of this trial is being presented. I am going to try and show you the types of harm that have been faced. Firstly, these crimes affected the Muslim civilian population. I'm not going to dwell on this point, which has already been extensively discussed, but simply cite victim 0945. When you see the anti-Balaka killing Muslims, whereas all the Muslims are not part of the Seleka. Secondly, all the Muslims are not of an Arabic origin. They were Christians who became Muslims. Everyone was free to choose their religion. There are Central African women who married Muslims and then later became Muslims. So I'm telling you, when you kill a Muslim, you are killing civilians. The second comment is the extreme violence and extreme cruelty of these crimes. For example, the massacre of the civilians in a family who sought refuge in the house of the Imam in Bosogoa. The people around there were killed. The people had their throats slit. We have already explained so we won't go back to this. Another example of this cruelty, of this inhuman behavior, is the attack of the convoy. Witness P1577 said, we followed them, so we followed the trucks who were fleeing. We followed them for some kilometers along the route, and we saw proof of attacks on these trucks, and we could see the presence of bodies riddled with bullets. There were also trucks that crossed the villages which had been attacked by the anti-Balaka. There were bodies everywhere on the ground. There were bodies that fell out of the trucks. And we even learned that a man had been arrested, that he had been tied up with an electric wire or a cable from a telephone along the route. I won't go further than that. Also, as regards the village of Sekia, what happened in Sekia, according to the testimony of witness 0475, Muslims are no longer there. In that village, they don't like to see the Muslims there in Sekia, even today, because in Sekia, the mosque was sold. I'm referring to the mayor of Sekia. He was responsible for everything that happened in Sekia, because it is he who sold the mosque. It is he who sold all the Muslim plots in Sekia. So not only the mosque, which was the symbol, but no Muslim, no owner has no longer anything in Sekia because of the actions of the mayor. Let us now look at the impact of this war. Because of all the displacement, the forced transfers and deportations, those who did not die after this flight, those who have survived, today find themselves in camps for displaced persons or in enclaves, attempting to survive. They are survivors, yes, but in reality they are the living dead. When they left, for example, their places, this is what the witness P2050 said. It is with tears in his eyes. The Christians came and took us in their arms, and we cried together. We too cried and wept. We did not expect that anywhere. We did not think that one day we would leave this place. It was really in deep sadness, because we were forced to give up everything. We had grown up together with them. We had to leave. There was great sadness. It was very difficult to support this. And another witness, 2354, said, people left crying because they had to leave behind all their worldly goods, their possessions. They could only take their lives with them. They had to give up everything. So you see, when they left, there were mixed feelings. There was a lot of sadness. But perhaps also, at that particular moment, even if they lost everything, there was a hope to say, well, perhaps we can come back. After all, it's our country. And we can come back. But today, this hope is dwindling. They are survivors, and in reality, they are the living dead. In their minds, they have memories that they'll never be able to forget. For example, in Bangui, 2050 explained that during the attack of the 5th of December, several bodies of killed Muslims were decaying in the main mosque because it was impossible to gain access to the Muslim cemetery, which meant that the burials took place in mass graves organized by the Red Cross. Furthermore, the bodies were buried either in compounds or in the fields, where they were also buried, for example, within the École de Liberté, which meant there were no tombs, no graves which they could have to keep alive the memory of the people who had died. This had a serious, irreversible impact. The impact on physical harm, on bodily harm, is complex because through these harms, there is a large part which is completely invisible. There is the entire body of the person, but it also affects the very way in which a human being works. It could be an intellectual harm or a psychic damage. And it has been explained, some have become blind, some have gone out of their mind, and they cannot be cured. You can't go back in time. You cannot return to the previous status quo. You can't pretend that nothing has happened. You cannot call back someone who has left this earth too early. You cannot give a family who has suffered such a handicap. Their roots, from their freedom, from their individual personality, from their culture. These are crimes against man and goes beyond that. It is a crime against humanity as a whole. The consequences of the destruction of the mosques We have shown you at length the scope of this. Just looking back at the destruction of the mosques by the Antibalaka. Witness P 1528 expresses his emotion as follows. And even if there are problems, even if people fight, if somebody enters a religious place of worship, in a house, in a church, in a mosque, in principle, these actions should at least stop. And even worse, if you destroy a church, a mosque, for me, it has no sense at all. The direct consequence, as touched upon by witness Ps 0475, the direct consequence of this loss of religiousness experienced by the Muslim community because of the very absence of mosques where they could gather together for regular prayer. There was fear, first of all, the impossibility to gather together in religious places is a great loss. Another consequence of this fear, other Muslims felt obliged to deny their religions, their faith, which had the direct consequence that they lost their identity. So there you see it. In a nutshell, a table of harm, individual, collective, physical, psychological, and material harm, which even today these Muslims face and are victims of. Now my conclusion. It's not possible to eradicate their pain and suffering, to cure their body and their minds. Some, bearing in mind the seriousness of the infringement of human rights and the scope of these rights, they are merely survivors. You have heard through various witnesses what the life was like in the camps or the enclaves and how it destroyed their soul. There in Chad, they deplore the long of their language, sango, of their culture, of their pride, of their identity. They no longer have a social existence. All this cannot be given back to them, and they are aware of that. But this trial can be efficient and at least give them some satisfaction. For the verification and the understanding of facts, for its disclosure, the qualifications of crimes against humanity and war crimes, to stop the violence and the consistent violation of human rights in their impunity. But further than that, because they have had access to the right of information and the possibility to have access to judicial truth. And finally, to re-establish through judicial decisions and judgment, to give them dignity, back their reputation, their rights as citizens, and to enable them to enjoy human rights. This trial will enable them to tell their story through the myriad of witnesses, and they will be able to tell the adult victims, men, women, children who have grown up, regardless of their age, because they can listen to the wide range of suffering and pain. They can let go of their emotions they can live their life in a different way, to try and find some form of appeasement somewhere, to have met a place, a body of justice which tells them, no, you are not forgotten victims. You are important to us. Your lives have value for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rabesandratana. Ms. Masida?
It will take not more than 21 minutes, I think, Your Honor, so I think I can proceed with your leave.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mhm. A very exact time estimate, I have to say, 21 minutes.
I thought it was interesting for you to know.
Absolutely, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madame et Messieurs les juges.
Your Honours, the victims participating in this case attach great importance to justice. One of them, who had to flee her home after her husband was murdered, and who now lives alone in the Central African Republic with her 6 children, told us, if justice isn't done properly, people will always think of revenge. So that's what we have to avoid. Because if there's revenge, there will be more than one person who will want to be avenged, and it will always go on, and we won't have peace. All we want is peace. But it's justice that must bring us peace. Another victim, whose mother was killed during the events, told us, I'm still alive, and I'm fighting for the truth to be told. We, in the Central African Republic, have suffered a lot, but the perpetrators of these crimes have still not been brought to justice. I know that my mother, who was killed on the 5th of December 2013, cannot be resuscitated. Like me, thousands of Muslim brothers have seen their family members murdered, their homes destroyed and looted, their communities disintegrated. You can't go to the market to buy a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a child, a cousin. Nothing in the world can replace the presence of lost family members. All I hope for from the court is that justice will be done and that it will convict those responsible for the abuses so that they acknowledge their actions and to ensure that this never happens again. Time and again, victims have told us that knowing justice has been done, that the perpetrators of the crimes have been found guilty and sentenced, and that the extent of their victimization and the harm they have suffered has been recognized in a court of justice, is already a form of reparation. Recognition of the criminal responsibility of the accused is therefore an essential element in the victim's quest for justice. Recalling our written submissions, my brief intervention today, I will limit myself on certain aspects which are relevant to the victims that we represent. Numerous pieces of evidence presented in the trial make it possible to conclude that Mr. Yekatom Ngaissona participated in the crimes attributed to them and that they are responsible for them under the confirmed modes of responsibility. In particular, the evidence demonstrates, as supported by the prosecution yesterday and this morning, that the 2 accused made an essential contribution to the commission of crimes, and in particular to the conception and implementation of the attack against the civilian population and the systematic targeting of Muslims. In this sense, the prosecution has demonstrated that the accused had an aim, purpose, and objective, a common aim, purpose, and objective, in particular the seizure of power through the targeting of the Muslim population in Bangui, including Boeing and Qatar, in Bimbo, and in the Lobai prefecture. And they contributed to this plan with the intent and knowledge required under Article 30 of the statute. Indeed, the evidence confirms the victim's account, according to which the attack was planned and executed with brutality, terrorizing, murdering, raping, torturing, inflicting inhuman treatment, destroying mosques, homes, shops belonging to Muslims, and looting them. The evidence also confirms that the victims were targeted because they were perceived to support the Seleka due to their ethnic, political, or religious affiliation. Consequently, the victims attach considerable importance to your recognition of the crime of persecution in connection with this attack. As emphasized by the prosecution in its final written submissions, Mr. Ngaissona,
the actions it took to realize this aim were numerous, continuing, and varied. End of quote. Les victimes partagent.
The victims share the analysis of the prosecution, according to which, from September 2013 at the latest, Mr. Ngaissona was part of the anti-Balaka leadership as a self-proclaimed political coordinator and was an influential and important member of the organization's structure. On his return to Bangui on the 14th of January 2014, he was officially appointed National General Coordinator of the anti-Balaka. As shown by the prosecution, through his behavior, the accused promoted and encouraged the anti-Balaka group's policy of targeting Muslim civilians, instigating a rise in popular hostility towards the Muslim community. He fueled the widespread hate speech of the anti-Balaka, aimed at justifying the commission of crimes against Muslims and the conflation of the Seleka forces with the Muslim population. Like several other anti-Balaka leaders, Mr. Ngaissona contributed to the propagation of a rhetoric of hatred and contempt towards the country's Muslim inhabitants, according to which Muslims should leave the Central African Republic, which belongs to the Central Africans, whom they define as Christians and traditionalists. Muslims were considered to be Chadians rather than fellow citizens, even if the vast majority of them hold, and all victims who participate do hold, full Central African nationality. Many of the victims reported hearing phrases such as, "We don't want any more Muslims in our country," or "We won't stop until all Muslims have left the country." The spread of this rhetoric, which represented a major change in the Central African Republic, where Muslim and Christian populations had, until now, lived together harmoniously, obviously created a climate of fear and panic among the country's Muslim population, and it increased the pressure on the same population, forcing them to take refuge elsewhere in the hope of escaping this escalation of violence which targeted them. Having been Minister for Youth in Bozize's government of national unity, Mr. Ngaissona had a very strong influence over Central African youth and was therefore in a position to mobilize them. In this respect, many victims report having been threatened at the time of the events by groups of young people who clearly demonstrated their hatred towards Muslims through acts of intimidation or by using insults against victims in order to instill fear and to force them to flee. With regards to the attack on Bossango on the 5th of December 2013, Mr. Ngaissona's defence, in disputing the totality of the crimes committed, ignores all the evidence and supports several positions that are irreconcilable with a holistic and prudent reading of all the available evidence. Contrary to the arguments put forward by Mr. Ngaissona, the evidence is clear and credible to the effect that the anti-Balaka attacked the Muslim civilian population, committing numerous murders of civilians not taking part in the hostilities. Contrary to the position put forward by Mr. Ngaissona's defence, the evidence presented at trial, including that of dual status witnesses P2457 and 2049, clearly and credibly demonstrates that the Muslim population was hemmed in at the École de la Liberté and could not leave freely for fear of being killed, which was led to a mass exodus of the Muslim population from the town. Mr. Ngaissona's assertions to the contrary are not supported by the evidence. More than 7,000 people were crammed into this enclave in appalling sanitary conditions, leaving behind all their possessions. Where it concerns Mr. Yekatom, the victims also support the position presented by the prosecution, according to which he contributed to the commission of crimes by structuring, training and equipping his anti-Balaka elements, by preparing the attacks and the advances of his group, and by participating in the execution of the crimes and by leading the group during the execution of the crimes, as well as by giving orders to the members of his group. Between September 2013 and December 2014, Mr. Yekatom was in command of approximately 3,000 elements that he had previously trained militarily in the Democratic Republic of Congo. As was emphasized in the prosecution in its final written submission, Mr. Yekatom organized his group according to a military-style hierarchy with subgroups headed by his deputies and sub-commanders. He exercised effective, or as P158 put it, absolute control over his elements. In the manner of a battalion commander, he would give them orders and instructions directly or through his deputies and commanders. His orders were executed. The proof shows the involvement of Mr. Yekatom and his elements in the crimes committed during the attack on Bangui on the 5th of December 2013. It was not, as the defence would have you believe, a legal, legitimate and limited operation. On the contrary, the elements of the case file make it possible to establish that before the attack, Mr. Yekatom indicated to his elements that the objective of their training was to kill Muslims and the Seleka. In using the words of the prosecution, and here I quote in English,
instruction that continue throughout the charge period. End of quote.
Numerous witnesses have told us that operations were carried out with the intention of driving all the Muslims towards PK5 and Mesquite. The Christians have been warned in advance and advised to place palm branches in front of their houses to show the anti-Balaka which houses to spare. The bodies of some of the Muslim civilians killed, including the traders murdered at Boeing Market, were taken to Ali Babalo Mosque in PK5. one witness stated that at least 60 bodies were taken to the mosque, and another witness gave detailed descriptions of the bodies of Muslim civilians at the mosque. P2682, P2050, P1576. Contrary to the defence's claims, the circumstances of their deaths are clear. These civilians were brutally attacked by the anti-Balaka, even though they were not a legitimate military target and they were not combatants. Furthermore, the victims strongly contested the defence's position on the causes of the Muslims' displacement. Indeed, Mr. Yekatom's defense alleges that the Muslims left Boeing and Qatar for a multitude of reasons. Your Honours, numerous credible witnesses have confirmed the persecution of the Muslim community. Faced with its systematic nature and brutality of the attacks, the victims had no choice but to flee. The intention of Mr. Yekatom is confirmed by the fact, proven during the trial, that in order to prevent the Muslim population from returning to Bangui, the elements of the accused took over Seleka roadblocks and set up new ones from January 2014, in particular at PK9, Sekia, Bimon, Capu, and Pisa. As regards the events that took place on the PK9 Mbaiki road, evidence in the case file does not support the defence's contention, according to which the aim of Mr. Yekatom was to ensure security and restore order in the region, or either that Muslims left the region en masse as a result of circumstances that were unrelated to the actions of Mr. Yekatom's group. The evidence shows beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Yekatom advanced towards PK9 and they continued their advance towards Mbaiki, taking control of towns and villages, and that this advance forced the Muslim civilians to flee, fearing for their lives. Thousands of Muslim civilians took refuge in Mbaiki using their own means of transport or with the help of other persons. The situation was so serious that Muslims had to be evacuated from Mbaiki in military trucks under escort. In this sense, the promises made by Mr. Yekatom following the meeting organised at Saint-Jean d'Arc Cathedral to protect the Muslim civilian population were nothing but empty promises. These opportunistic promises did not represent any real intention on the part of the accused to help Muslim civilians, but only to restore his image in the eyes of the authorities. Indeed, the evidence shows that after the meeting, heinous crimes continued to be committed, including the murder of the deputy mayor, Mr. Dijoseli. Furthermore, the unequivocal anti-Muslim gesture of even close members of the accused groups immediately after the meeting demonstrate the true criminal intent of Mr. Yekatom and his group. Finally, with regard to the events that took place at the Yamwara school, the victims support the prosecution's position with regards to the offence. The position of the defence, according to which members of Yekatom's group had legitimate reasons for arresting them, or that they had been targeted not because they were Muslims, but because they had links to the Seleka, is not supported by the evidence in the case, which demonstrates that the victims of these incidents were vulnerable and defenceless, and that they were not participating in the hostilities. No legitimate reason could justify their arrest and detention for several days. Nor could it justify constantly threatening them with death, subjecting them to brutal and inhuman treatment, forcing them to undress. No legitimate reason could justify the commission of a sordid murder. The evidence in the case file, seen in its entirety, proves that the victims were targeted specifically because of their ethnicity and religion, as well as because of their alleged political support for the Seleka. The victims also reject the vain attempt by Mr. Yekatom's defence to demonstrate that certain witnesses to this incident would have lied during their testimony or attempted to collude in order to falsely incriminate Mr. Yekatom. Quite the contrary, the witnesses showed courage and objectivity in their testimony and demonstrated the extent of the crimes that they had suffered and their victimization. Possible contradictions between testimonies do not demonstrate collusion or a desire at all price to incriminate Mr. Yekatom, but can easily be explained by the passage of time or the trauma that these victims have suffered. To conclude, Mr. Yekatom and his co-perpetrators knew that the implementation of the plan to violently target the Muslim civilian population would lead them to the commission of crimes, and they acted with the intention of committing them. The accused was fully aware and intended by his acts and omissions to ensure that the crimes were committed within the common objective and criminal policy of the anti-Balaka. The structure and organization of his group enabled him, together with other co-perpetrators, to control and use its elements to commit the crimes. Even knowing that elements of his groups had committed the crimes, Mr. Yekatom never investigated and never held anyone to account, preferring instead to congratulate and reward the perpetrators of the crimes, as testified by P. 1839. Your Honours, in recent consultations with our clients to prepare closing submissions, victims have expressed their thanks for the opportunity they have been given during the proceedings to present their views and concerns. They also told us what they were expecting from the outcome of this trial. The victims hope that the Chamber will listen to their views and their concerns. They hope that the Chamber will recognise the extent of their suffering and harm, the effects of which are still being felt today. They also hope that the Chamber will render a judgment which takes into account their opinions by declaring that Mr. Yekatom and Mr. Ngaissona are guilty of all the crimes with which they are charged. This concludes, Your Honours, the closing statements on behalf of the 1,673 victims that we represent. We thank you.
I think we should have the break until 2:15, although it's a bit odd, but 14:15 for everyone.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.